Welcome back to another wonderful Lord's Sunday and another wonderful Sunday school class. We are continuing in our series, I guess you could say, on Daniel chapter 11. Just as a reminder to us, the point of this series initially is going to be talking about the historical aspects that are being fulfilled within this prophecy of Daniel chapter 11. There will be a time, and we may even get there this morning, but there may be a time when, or there will be a time when we shift from historical events that have already been fulfilled to future events. And so we'll need to talk about the typology, and we'll need to talk about Antiochus IV and the relationship to the Antichrist, and then especially how New Testament authors and how New Testament figures use Daniel chapter 11 and really on into Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 through 5 and things like that. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. Just as a short reminder here, we are not getting into every detail. We're just looking for kind of overarching points of connection right now. We're believing that Daniel chapter 11 was prophetic, written, in 550-ish BC, but then most of these events are taking place in, what would it be, the 2nd century, early 1st century BC. So you're thinking between, right now we've covered several hundred years up to verse 25. Right now we're probably right on the edge of 190 BC or so. So again, from Daniel's perspective, it's prophecy, but from our perspective, looking back, much of this has already been fulfilled. So just a quick points of reminder there for us. The plan of what we're doing, we're looking at the historical stuff, then we'll be looking at future stuff and getting into that. And so all of that's to come. We find ourselves here, if I believe and remember correctly, we ended somewhere in verse 25, either having begun verse 25 or having finished verse 25, but we're going to start in verse 25 for us today. Remember the objectives here. If we're getting a general sense for the historical fulfillment, then we're pretty good to go. If we're learning a little bit more about the historical part and aspects and what's going on, then we're also good to go. We're getting what we can out of this. We're here in Daniel chapter 11, verse 25. If we could have pause the video at this time and have one person read Daniel chapter 11, verses 25 all the way through 34. Daniel chapter 11, verse 25 all the way through 34. That'll be good. Thank you so much. All right, thank you so very much for reading. I definitely appreciate that. So we're starting here in verse 25. And he shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. The king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him. Even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. So what is actually happening here in verses 25 and 26? We're remembering that I am heavily relying on John Goldingay's Word Biblical Commentary, the Revised Edition, for all of these historical details. So let's consult our friend John Goldingay and see what he's going to tell us about these verses so far. Here it is. In 170 BC, Egyptian forces tried to take Judea, and Antiochus IV wins and conquers Egypt and Ptolemy VI. Right, so we're now on that we're past, it seems like, Ptolemy V. We're now in Ptolemy VI ruling in Egypt. They try to take back Judea, but Antiochus comes and defeats him. Ptolemy VI was betrayed. having his son crowned king in Alexandria. Antiochus then installs Ptolemy VI, his nephew, over Ptolemy VII as a puppet king. Okay? These two kings then that we see in verse 27 are Antiochus IV and Ptolemy VI. So what's happened? Okay, so remember, back in verse 17, if you're looking at Daniel chapter 11 and you go backwards to verse 17, it says, "He shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom. He shall bring terms of an agreement to before them. He shall give the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage." That's Antiochus III giving his daughter in marriage to Ptolemy the Fifth. Okay, Ptolemy the Fifth. Remember, Antiochus IV is the son of Antiochus III. So Cleopatra, which is the daughter of Antiochus III, is the sister to Antiochus IV. Cleopatra and Ptolemy V then have a son, Ptolemy VI. Right? So Ptolemy VI is Antiochus IV's nephew. Okay, so just a reminder there of relationships, and a reminder. I had to actually go back and check that out and rethink about that. But that's just a reminder for us of that historical detail. So when we get here to verse 25, it's actually kind of in-house family that's battling, right? You have Antiochus VI, who is the nephew of Antiochus IV. They're fighting with one another in Judea. Antiochus IV wins. There are plots devised against Ptolemy VI, and Ptolemy VI's son is crowned king. Okay, in Alexandria. However, Antiochus IV comes and defeats Egypt and reinstalls his nephew, Ptolemy VI, as king. Okay? And Ptolemy VI at this point is a puppet king. Okay? So that's what's happening there in verse 26 and 25 and 26. Again, you have all these masculine pronouns, he, his, him, and sometimes it's hard to keep track of who is going where. But that's just the general sense of what's happening and going on. Verse 27, "And as for these two kings," who were there these two kings? It's Antiochus IV and his nephew, Ptolemy VI. That's the two kings. Okay? These then lie to each other and deceive each other. Their hearts are bent on doing evil. They speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for the end is yet to be at the time appointed. Meaning this, neither of their ultimate purposes or plans can come to fruition. They lie, they are both bent on doing evil, both bent on conquering one another or reconquering each other, and yet still nothing happens at that. Verse 28, "And he shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his own land." This he is talking about Antiochus IV. He returns with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant. Whenever you see that holy covenant, you're then thinking about the promised land. You're thinking about the Jews. John Goldengay says simply this, Antiochus IV looks to rob the temple in Jerusalem. And that's what he's set against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will. He indeed actually robs the temple and gets away with it. Okay? So that's where we are in verse 28. Verse 29, "At the time appointed he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. here's something really important that every commentator that I read points out. At the time appointed means that God is still sovereign and in control over these events of what's happening. And there are going to be some pretty awful events that are very quickly summarized here in the next few verses. And that means God is still in control. And this is an Old Testament perspective that we really need to understand, and it's been all throughout Daniel, that Yahweh, God of Israel, whom we worship as Father, right? We worship him as Father, and Jesus Christ, his Son, and the Holy Spirit, the beautiful, holy, triune God, is sovereignly in control of human history and over all nations, regardless of good or evil happening. So God is in control at the time appointed. Okay, at the time appointed, basically what happens, Antiochus is going to be coming to reconquer Egypt, but he's not going to be successful. But it shall not be this time as it was before. He's not successful. Why? Here you see here you see that word for. For is going to mean because, right? For or because. It's going to explain to us why Antiochus IV is not successful. For the ships of Kittim. Well, it's the ships of Kittim. The ships of Kittim. Kittim can really mean Western people. It's an ancient name for Cyprus. In different places, it can basically mean the West. Here, Kittim means Rome. For ships of Rome shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged. Remember that Antiochus IV was a hostage in Rome because of his father losing the battle at Thermopylae, and then again at Magnesia. That's where, near Smyrna. Okay, and so Antiochus III loses those two battles, meaning that Antiochus IV is also he had not just been a hostage of Rome, but he's also still a vassal of Rome. He's still paying tribute to Rome as part of the not quite part of the Roman Empire yet, but you get the idea that he's a servant to the Roman Empire. So when Rome comes here, for ships of Kittim shall come, when Rome comes in, they automatically have jurisdiction. They automatically have the power to do what they want. And they basically order him to go away. And he's afraid and withdraws, right? I mean, Rome's a big deal. And they have the power to back up their commands. And so Antiochus IV withdraws, turns back, and be enraged and take action against the Holy Covenant. So this is an action against the people of the Promised Land, against Israel. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Okay, so what's happening here? A few different things. Here we go. What happens in this time is that there's a high priest at this time named Jason, who had been installed by Antiochus IV and then removed from power as high priest in favor of a different high priest. And Jason, who's exiled, supposes that or hears that Antiochus IV has died in Egypt. Okay. So he then creates a violent rebellion against his successor Menelaus and the Tobiads ruling party in Jerusalem. Okay, so this is Jason the high priest, comes in against them. Antiochus IV sees this as trying to install a pro-Egypt government and puts down the rebellion. He reestablishes the Tobiad leadership, as in those who forsake the covenant. So the Tobiad leadership in Israel are those who forsake the covenant, and they're reestablished. Now, That is summarizing very, very briefly a very in-depth part. Antiochus IV is indeed enraged, and his putting down of the rebellion is awful. It's a terrible slaughter. All right, and so though that's not necessarily detailed here, it's a huge part of the Israel's history during this time, but it's actually just very, very shortly summarized. Okay. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple fort and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering. So right here again, we're getting into specific things that happen against the people of Israel. Here we go. Gentile troops stop the burnt offering, and most importantly, then they set up the abomination that makes desolate. And right there, we should be thinking and remembering, and we're like, oh yes, I remember those words from Jesus, the abomination that causes desolation. What's the abomination that makes desolation? It's this. The Gentile troops set up their own gods in the temple of God. Okay? Generally thinking, the Gentiles think that all of these gods are the same. So they think that they actually worship Baal Samim, who is the Syrian equivalent to Zeus. Right, so now we're thinking Zeus. Oh yeah, Zeus is the Greek god. He's the head of the pantheon. The Syrians are worshiping Baal Samim, which they equate with Zeus. And then guess who they put on the same level as that? The God of Israel. They put Yahweh on the same. They think they're all the same. They think they're all equivalent. And so they set up this altar to Zeus to worship the god, or to worship that god. And they think that they're simply helping Israel to understand that Zeus, Baal Samim, and Zeus are all the same gods. Okay, and of course that's not true. So it instead becomes something that absolutely desolates the temple. Right, it would drive out. Suppose God's presence would have already left for this to happen, but it basically makes the entire temple defiled and in need of cleaning. Notice this then. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. What happens here? The Jews are drawn into an agreement and policy that goes beyond their original thoughts. Right? So Antiochus IV deceives many of the Jews, seduces them into violating the covenant and going way beyond what they ever thought they would do. And they're deceived. The people who acknowledge God remain committed and resist the policy. These are called Hasidim. I think that word might mean saints or holy ones, but it's those who remain loyal to God. So there are people who discern. They're the wise. There are those who among them who discern what's taking place and don't give in. They continue to worship their God, but there's others who are seduced. All right, there's others who are seduced by Antioch. Who's the he? Antiochus IV. Okay. And the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. Well, what's happening here? They are, the pious ones, or the wise, are discerning the prophecy, perhaps this prophecy, or simply perhaps discerning what is happening around them in the time period. And they're helping make many understand what's going on. But guess what? They're also under persecution. Stumble, killed, delayed by sword, flame, captivity, and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help. A little help here just means the help of men. Okay, so a little help simply means the help of men. That's little help. And many shall join themselves to them with flattery, and some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. Here, it's interesting that there are those who cannot be trusted in the long run. All right, there are those who join the cause. There are those who join the wise. There are those who sign up and say, yes, I want to remain pious, and yet it's all just flattery. And guess what? They then make some of the wise stumble. Now that stumbling really means martyrdom. Okay, it means that they make some of them die. They're traitors. They make some of the wise die. What's the purpose? So that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. So it ends up being a test of others, a test of those who might go on to martyrdom, a test of those who are under fire. It becomes a test. All right. So here then is kind of the ending of the historical portion for the time of the prophecy. Everything that we can trace from Daniel chapter 11, verse 1 through 35, can be traced really in depth. I mean, it's extraordinarily accurate as to what happens in these time periods. Some of it is a little general, and yet still there are things that fit in perfectly as we would expect of prophecy. Okay, as we would expect of the prophecies. And so we've studied that, and we've seen that. Here we're going to be getting into verses 36 through 45. We're going to start in verse 36 through 39. But what happens here, let me just give a brief summary. What's going to begin to happen in verses 36 through 39 is a little bit of a shift. It could be here that it's still remaining historical, talking about the figure of Antiochus IV and kind of describing his personality. But it could also easily be describing the type of the Antichrist who is to come at the end time and begin to deceive the saints. In verses 40 through 45, there's much less like historical pinpointing within the time frame of Antiochus IV with any degree of accuracy. It actually seems like a prophecy that is for the future, for the Antichrist figure. And so what we begin to see is the blurring of the lines, where then Antiochus IV begins to be described as and seen as a type of the Antichrist to come. And that then makes us reread Daniel 11 in a new light, not just as something that has happened, but as something as of types of what will come, or types of things that the Antichrist may do, the sorts of actions that he will go about doing. The types of persecutions, the types of flattery and deceiving, the types of manipulation. And so let's go ahead and begin with verses 36 through 39. So at this time, if one person could, if we'll pause the video, have one person read for us Daniel chapter 11, verses 36 through 39, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. So again, we're going into this time where it can be Antiochus IV's personality and things that he did, and it can also be looking at the type of person Antiochus IV was, so that we have kind of a general outline of what the Antichrist will be like. Listen to this. And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. What's happening here? All right. Antiochus IV took the title of Epiphanes, which means God manifest, and used theos, which is the Greek word for God, on his coins. He used divine symbols, plundered temples, and suppressed religions other than his own. All right, so this is the type of person Antiochus was, and the older he grew, the worse he got. Now, it wasn't necessarily uncommon for ancient kings to also take on the person's personality, or the role, let's say, of a son of a god, right? Pharaoh in Egypt was considered to be the son of Ra, their sun god, the head god of Egypt. In Rome, the Caesars would eventually begin to be called sons of God, and there was a cult of the emperor. Usually, it would be they would be worshipped after they were living, but sometimes even while they were living, they were beginning to be sacrificed to and honored as a sort of god. That's one of the reasons why Jesus claiming Son of God, that title is also a power play against Rome as well. I mean, it's a direct confrontation with Rome in the Gospels and throughout the letters. And so Jesus is, of course, the Son of God, but then you have this pretender, the emperor, also claiming that sort of title. Here, Antiochus IV does so, but he does so tremendously while he's alive. He's proclaiming himself to be God, not just the son of a god, but God himself. And so he's doing that, and he's claiming it on his coins. He uses the title Epiphanes, which means God manifest, uses divine symbols, plunders temples, and suppresses the religions of everyone except his own. All right. Notice here then that there is a time when the indignation will be over, right? So even speaking for a historical way, Antiochus IV did meet his end. These sorts of things can only go on so long, which is the hope of the Jews of that day, and also for us as Christians. The time periods in which we live in cannot go on this way forever. There's a certain decreed time for them to go on. All right, verse 37, he shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers or to the one beloved by women. That's the figure of Antiochus IV. Just doesn't pay attention to any of the gods. The god of the women could be one of the gods from Egypt, or maybe Dionysus, or another sort of god or goddess. It doesn't necessarily matter. The point is, he shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. He claims the role of being the top god. He shall honor the god of the fortress instead of these. A god whom his fathers did not know he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. Well, who is that? The stronghold god, according to John Goldingay, is Zeus, who is installed as and worshipped as Baal Samim by Syrian troops. And of course, we are recognizing that God's name, Baal, at least that first part, the most hated god who's continually in conflict for worship of the people. And northern Israel fell into the worship of Baal under one of the first kings, but especially one of the worst was King Ahab and his wife Jezebel. Definitely worship Baal, and so we're hearing that name, we remember it from the Old Testament, and we know, oh yes, all right, so Antiochus IV is honoring Zeus as his god, and that's actually in Syrian, it's Baal Samim. All right. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledge him shall load him with honor. He shall make them rulers over many and shall divide the land for a price. So the man can be bought. He can give out the rule of different lands quickly and ably as he wills. And these are the sorts of things that Antiochus IV did. Now this personality type then goes back to and seems to reference or be a type for the Antichrist in the future to come. This is where then in verse 40 we're going to see some shifts, because what happens here in verse 40 doesn't necessarily play out in history, at least with the information that we now have. And so let's pause here and have one person read for us, please, Daniel chapter 11, verse 40 through 45. Thank you. So the text, we've just had it read. I'm just going to summarize John Goldingay's point. This is on page 545. He says this: if this is Antiochus IV, it cannot be correlated to events as verses 21 through 39 can, at least with current data. The northern king as it is... Alright, so that would be the initial point. Like these verses, at least with our current data, our current knowledge, cannot be correlated to Antiochus IV as all of the rest of it kind of can. Because the rest of it, even from verse 1 and on, it's really beginning that history of the Seleucid Empire, which Antiochus IV rules over, and the Ptolemy Empire, and those two kings, the king in the north and the king in the south, battle through. Here then, we come to a hermeneutical decision. Hermeneutic means interpretation decision. There are some who look at this and say, well, since it can't be correlated to Antiochus IV, or maybe it can't be correlated with other things that we are aware of at this time, or other different kings that we're thinking about, because it says at the time of the end, remembering that verses 1 through 39, although a lot of it does trace on 20 verses or so, even though 20 verses or so trace on Antiochus IV, from something like verse 20-ish or so all the way through 39, about 20 verses trace on Antiochus IV. Doesn't mean that everything has to be fitted into Antiochus IV. This could be a historical description of something else that comes. However, traditionally it's been tried to fit to Antiochus IV, and it doesn't fit. This brings us to the hermeneutical conundrum. There's only two options, really. Number one, there's an option to say, well, this was really written while these events were going on, somewhere in 170 BC. And what happens is the person actually simply writes historical fact from verses 1 through 39, then takes a educated guess, right, at what happens next, and he gets it wrong. And so there are commentators that will take that route and say, well, it's just all history, this isn't really prophecy, and it was written in 170 BC or something like that, right before Antiochus IV's end, and poor lad, he just takes his best educated guess and gets it wrong. There's probably some faithful people who take that interpretation, but I don't think that that's a very faithful way of looking at the text. And so if we're looking at the text like this, what we then say is verses 1 through 39 describe historical events, but then verses 33 through 39 begin a transition point for us, and verses 40 through 45 begin to tell us about something else. It's a jump in history, remembering that this report is being given by a spiritual being to Daniel. And the reason why verses 1 through 39 are so accurate is so that you have confidence to look for verses 40 to 45 happening at some point in time. And definitely by the time we get to Daniel chapter 12, which begins to talk about and proclaim the resurrection, we're thinking about things that are happening at the end of days. All right, and so there are good reasons to begin to faithfully say, actually what's happening here is a transition. And what happened in verses 1 through 39 is to give us confidence in verses 40 and Daniel 12 to say, yes, this stuff will happen in the future. It also then begins to help us to understand the type of the Antichrist in Antiochus IV. And that's going to be a major role because Daniel has a huge impact on the New Testament thought, especially in relationship to the Antichrist and the latter days, the end days. We're going to get into that beginning next Sunday. We'll jump into that and try to knock it out in one session. Probably not exhaustively, but just giving some really good data points there for us to take home. And then after that, we'll try to apply some more other general things too, maybe from the text. But let's take a look here at some things that we can understand. The time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, right? So the king of the south is Egypt, really, usually that's sensed. The king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen and with many ships. So there'll be a great end-time battle. The king of the north, what's really fascinating is that the king of the north is usually always the great ancient enemy of Israel. Assyria comes from the north. Let me see if I can pull up an atlas. All right, here's an atlas. This is a much later date. But Assyria is going to be around here, the Assyrian Empire. Okay, it's going to be on the Euphrates River. When they come to conquer Israel, they come from the north. Babylon. When Babylon is an empire under Nebuchadnezzar and under his father, guess where they come from to conquer Israel? They come from the north. Why? They can't go through this desert. It's too vast for the time period. So they're coming from the north. Persia, right? Cyrus is kind of the savior, according to Isaiah, of the people, releases Judah back from exile. But if he ever needed to conquer, you know where it comes from? The north. Rome. You know where they come from? Ships in the sea and the north over land, right? So you have the ancient enemy of Israel always coming from the north. Now the king of the south, Egypt is kind of like the broken reed, the broken staff, which Israel far too often goes to lean on. They're not necessarily friends of Israel, but really the ancient enemies are always coming from the north. Okay, so we kind of understand that, and we can get that. And he shall come into countries and shall overflow and pass through. So he's conquering. He shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand. Edom and Moab and the main part of the Ammonites. What's fascinating here is these are usually either enemies of Israel, or throughout their history are sometimes the vassals of Israel, but they're always looking to break their bonds. And Edom, Moab, and the Ammonites are usually those who gloat over the destruction of Israel. He shall stretch out his hand, that's the king of the north, stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape, shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and silver and of all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. But news from the east and the north shall alarm him. He shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. He shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. So there's kind of, there's not much else to say other than what the text has for us in describing the King of the North, because these events are yet to come, and so we're not quite sure how they will play out. But we can keep our eyes on events of Israel and just kind of see what may happen. Alrighty, I'm looking at our time. That's probably going to be it for today. Thank you so very much for joining us. Remember, if you're picking up some of the historical details, that's great. Next week, we'll dive into the typology. As Antiochus IV was, so the Antichrist will be. We'll bring in some other helps, and we'll look at some New Testament text as well to see how they're going. Thank you so very much. Hope to see you upstairs. Blessings to you all. Bye-bye.